Okay, I'm going to make a start. So thank you everybody for being here for this ExChange webinar. I'm Dr. Sophie Hallett from Cardiff University. I'm just going to introduce my colleagues. Abid, do you want to say hi?
Hi, I'm Abid Quinaziz from Cardiff University as well.
And Melissa.
Hi everyone, I am Melissa Mendes, also from Cardiff University.
So yes, we're here to share some resources that have been developed specifically around safeguarding. And they're those check your thinking cards. And Sean has posted a link to those in the chat so you can have a look at them. So as the structure of the day, what we're going to do is Sophie is doing this introduction. And I'll say just a little bit about why racism is important, I suppose, and in some ways it's strange having to do that. And then Melissa will look through some case studies or a case study, and then we'll come back to the cards and leave you an opportunity to ask questions. If you want to ask questions during our presentations, or if you have questions that come up during the presentations, put them in the chat, and Alison Rees is moderating them, and we'll take them at the end of the session. If it looks like Sophie's disappeared, so what I'll do, so the next part of this presentation was me, so I'll just carry on, I suppose. I think I just said about, the strangeness about even thinking about how to explain why anti-racist practices is important in social work. I watched the film Blinded by the Light by Safras Mansour, who talks about an Asian boy growing up in Luton, and just last night finished a book, Afterlife, by Abdul Razak Gurnam, about an African boy growing up in East Africa during colonial times. And of course, there's all that stuff in the media about racism, people we might not even mention. And what it does, it's a reminder of real life experiences that are part of our history and leave long-term effects, and having to bring that up all the time as well. So a workshop like this is an invitation for you to engage with these issues. And there are issues for all of us to address. We won't go into depth, that we're not looking at whiteness studies, but often issues of racism are left to people of colour to address, and actually they need all of us to do. We invite comments, and in some ways we're not doing ground rules because it's not an interactive session, but what we would invite you to do is to try things out, say things, or ask the questions that you have, rather than feeling too scared to say anything. I think one of the things about any work around anti-oppression is that often people feel paralyzed and feel they can't say anything, and that doesn't get anywhere. We don't want guilt, we want action. So what we're aiming to do is for you to learn from this and to take it with you, and to get skills on how to facilitate people thinking about issues of, for example, racism in safeguarding. So what is racism? I suppose I start with just an acknowledgement that race is a social construct, and we can trace the history of when race and racism became a thing, and we can have ideas about why that happened and who it serves. But often in groups, when we think about racism, we think about it as being out there in other countries, in other professions, and in other people's histories. And over the last few years, we got to realize it wasn't just George Floyd in the USA, but Mayoud Bashir, Mahmoud Hassan, Christopher Kapesa in Wales, South Wales, the imprisonment of Sian Mangaza. We saw the impact of COVID, we saw Black Lives Matter. Issues just became highlighted. So understanding that those experiences around us and in social work as well. For me, working in HEI, think about some of the reports over the last few years, the awarding gap in degrees across universities, and the impact of racism in higher education. So as coming more into social work, there are lots of studies, though not very much conclusive proof or evidence about the impact of race on people using services. But we have a feeling, and there's general, it qualifies their findings, that you can't just say this is around race. So for example, the deaths in COVID. We've got data on social workers, referrals for fitness to practice. We've got data around students, their progression, feeling isolated. Research not in Wales yet, but research in English universities teaching social work about students talking about either their lecturers not knowing how to talk about racism or leaving it to them to pick up, or the uncomfortable feeling when race becomes a thing. A Baswa Cymru survey in 2022, just one of the findings, I suppose, only 13% of the people surveyed felt that anti-racist values were emphasized in their experience. 25% felt that they were sometimes emphasized. And the rest of the respondents felt that anti-racism values were not emphasized at all. I suppose things do change through the years, but there is still a fight about bringing racism into the conversation. Again, I wasn't going to mention it, but think about Diane Abbott, and whatever you might think about it, think of the pile-on that's happened. So it's important in society, it's important in social work. In terms of the kind of progress, we all know about the anti-racist action, All Wales Anti-Racist Action Plan, and the subgroups that have been set up from there. And there is a subgroup looking at health and social care. I was just looking at some of the targets last week, and we have missed quite a few already. Social work programs across Wales are looking at planning around how to bring anti-racism into the programs, and that feels like quite an exciting development. And we're working with Social Care Wales around how we make that central to our work. The Social Work Association of Social Workers Scotland and Scottish HEI are much further developed in their work. And I'm currently working on a study looking at race and fitness to practice referrals across the 4 nations. Social Care Wales itself has appointed an EDI officer, and they're taking EDI quite seriously, not quite, they're taking it seriously. And Social Care Wales with eLab are looking at research, innovation and improvement, taking an EDI strand to it. So hearing the voices of those people that often don't get listened to. There was, just last week, there was a social work education anti-racist network inaugural conference. Sadly, it was in London and I couldn't make it, but a couple of members from Baswa Cymru went, and they're going to feed back to us. There's a Baswa UK anti-racist group, and there's a Baswa Cymru anti-racist practice group. You're all welcome to join. So I suppose the summary, we've come a long way. There's still loads to do, and let's work together to do it. So if I can just hand over to Melissa now, who will introduce her part of this presentation.
Thank you so much. Right, so I'm Melissa, and I'm here to talk just a little bit about thinking through who you're supporting when you're doing the work that you're doing, and where they come from, and why that's important in terms of supporting children and families. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit about who I am. So I'm a criminologist rather than an expert in social care or social work, but my research in criminology has been with young people, particularly from disadvantaged backgrounds. And so I think there's a lot of overlap in the disciplines as it relates to engaging with children and young people. I'm originally from Trinidad and Tobago. I've lived in Cardiff for over 10 years. I've lived in London as well while I studied there. Fairly well educated. I have attended some of the top universities in the UK. I am a lawyer, trained barrister. I have practiced law in the Caribbean. I think I'm fairly articulate and pleasant, or at least I try to be. I live in a nice house in a nice area in Cardiff. I think that I am fairly good at navigating between different social class and different status groups within society. So why have I just engaged in that very awkward for me bit of self-revelation? It's not because I want you to sort of marvel about how clever I am or I think I am. It is, though, to sort of demonstrate that I am an adult in this world who occupies, in many ways, quite a privileged space in society. And I do acknowledge that. And still, I am really, really cautious when I'm engaging with people in positions of power. I'm not just talking about the police, but I'm talking about doctors, immigration officials, genuinely, even my pharmacist. And I'm cautious because socio-legal and criminological research tells me that I probably should be cautious. But my lived experience and the experiences of some of my family members who have lived in the UK for a lot longer than I have, their experience tells me that I need to be cautious when I'm interacting with certain groups of people. And this kicks in really strongly for me when I'm dealing with someone who has the ability, the responsibility, and the power to make my life a little bit easier or a little bit harder. And I do this, as I said, like as an adult who occupies quite a privileged space in society. You know, I manage my presentation to the world. And so I can only imagine, and I don't have to imagine because I did get some of this from my own participants in my research, when you're dealing with young people and children, how much more so they are engaging with this exercise. So this is me. And I just want you to think a little bit about who you are. So I imagine that many of you here today are people in positions of power or people who have responsibility for children and young people in some capacity. So you'll be practitioners, professionals or carers, people who have the ability to make people's lives a little bit easier or a little bit harder. So from the get-go, you know, it is likely that many of your clients will be approaching you with caution. You know, they may not trust easily. Their backgrounds and their experiences, the experiences of their friends, the experiences of some of their family members, that would have shaped their view of the world and their view of you. And you might say, well, yeah, that's pretty obvious. You know, we all do that. We all manage our presentations of self. We're all shaped by our experiences, the experiences of our families. But we haven't all experienced racism, you know, and many of the families that you will interact with will have experienced racism. And that really is a key difference. So I think that one of the key things that you know, we need to think about and you need to think about in some of these spaces when you are in that position of power is who you are, who you represent to that child, that young person, that family that you're going to be interacting with, how they are going to perceive you based on their experiences. So I'm going to use an example from my criminological wheelhouse. I hope that it is an example that you're familiar with. I imagine that many of you will have some knowledge about the Windrush generation, if not the Windrush scandal a bit more broadly. And one of the things that I found really interesting about you know, my own sort of, I have an interest in the Windrush generation. So from my own research and experiences, was how much at the time the police misunderstood the culture of the group. And in that misunderstanding of the culture of the group, they responded and treated with the group with these misunderstandings of culture, implementing really, really poor strategies. And they only sort of much later better understood that behavior that they saw at the time as really problematic and challenging really wasn't the way that they had initially viewed it. But by then it was too late in many ways, because many police officers had sort of gained a really negative perception of the group, the Windrush generation that they'd been policing. And many of the Windrush generation, the people who were being policed, grew to have a really negative view of the police. So Sir Peter Imbert, who's a former commissioner of the Met, recognized these tensions in this quote here. So he says, it's often been said that the young Caribbean youth had a street culture, whereas the indigenous youth who's living in London didn't have a street culture in quite the same way. I think that we in the police didn't understand that. When we saw Black youth hanging around the street corners, we couldn't understand why. We automatically thought, quite wrongly of course, on every occasion that they were up to no good. But that was because of a lack of understanding of their culture and their way of life. And hanging around on street corners definitely is, in many ways, very much Caribbean culture. And it isn't about people necessarily being up to no good or engaging in problematic behavior, but it is a cultural thing. But as Peter Imbert says, that was understood too late, after harsher policing methods had already damaged relationships between the groups. Now, the trouble with this is that that these challenges between the groups, it formed and continues to form a culture of relations and relationships between the groups. Black Britons are often raised with an understanding of how and why their grandparents and their parents moved to the UK. And sort of, we were sticking with the Windrush generation, they speak with pride about, their families moving to the UK, helping to transform Britain after the Second World War. But that particular history isn't really taught elsewhere, and it certainly isn't taught within the police. And police racial awareness training, as it exists, certainly as it existed, sort of ignores, and it doesn't it definitely ignores these origins. At one point, I think it was in the 80s, the Met organized a session of meetings between young Black people and police officers in Hackney. And I'll read what Whitfield, who's done some research in the area, what Whitfield said about these meetings that they were having between the young Black population and the police. He says, one of the aspects of this training that was happening was the young people explaining to the officers why they feel they're not being properly policed. And a lot of it was to do with the history. They were able to say, our parents told us about this. Our grandparents told us, we've seen it on television. They had come to this training with history. Many of the police officers were saying, well, it's nothing to do with us. We weren't there. So why are you expecting us to know what attitudes you're coming with? It took the officers a very long time, and Whitfield says, I'm not sure that they left hearing these very clear messages of how current policing is informed by history. And I think obviously, when we're not talking about policing today, well, not policing in sort of the policing sense of it, but in essence, there is still that care and control that you would, as a practitioner, that you would mediate with the people that you interact with. And so I think that this is something that we want to avoid. So earlier, the sort of the beginning of this session, Abid said something that I thought was really, really powerful. He said, we don't want guilt, we want action. As practitioners and carers, people with responsibility for making lives a little bit better, but who can also make things a little bit worse, We want to avoid some of what we're seeing in this particular extract about the police. We want to avoid dismissing trauma or poor experiences historically because we weren't the ones who caused it. You know, it's really important that we are sensitive to that history and the experiences of the people that we interact with. And I do have this quote here, and it's a quote that I've taken from one of my participants in my own research. And I'm actually not going to read it. I'm going to leave it because there is a lot that's happening here that we don't really have the time to unpack it, I think, in the way that I would have liked to do. So I'm going to leave it. But I would love for you to come back to the in-person sessions that we'll be having, either the one in Cardiff or the one in Bangor, and we'll be unpacking some of this and also some other excerpts from experiences of young people with people in positions of power. What I sort of do want to say is that one of the really important things that, you know, as practitioners, I feel like we do need to remember is that the way that we interact with people, the way that we treat particularly the children and young people that we come into contact with, it really shapes their beliefs and their understanding, not just of the world, which, you know, I've already sort of mentioned in the beginning, you know, their perceptions of the world and how they must present themselves, but it very much also affects their sense of belonging. And I think that's something that we don't think about enough. And Bradford, Murphy, and Jackson, and this is a quote where they're talking about, again, about policing, but it's something that very much applies, I think, to social work as well. So they say, fair treatment communicates that we respect you. We see you as a worthwhile member of this community. Promoting identification by generating a positive sense of the individual's place in society. By contrast, unfair treatment signals marginalization by or exclusion from society. Legitimacy of the organization, whether that's the police or the social care and social work, you know, the council or whatever it is, the legitimacy of that organization will suffer because, well, not only because the power holder seems to be abusing his or her power, but also because people become alienated from the group that the police or the social worker represents. So again, this is something that we want to avoid. We want to avoid further stigmatizing and traumatizing groups of people who are already experiencing or may already be experiencing stigma and trauma. And we want to ensure that we are communicating to people that they are valued, so that we can really assist them in doing the things that they need to do to have and to engage in better lives. And I just want to finish with just a really brief, and I've taken this from one of the cards that Sophie's going to talk about in a minute. It says, stop and think. Difference doesn't always mean something is a problem or a safeguarding issue. And I think, you know, this is something that I think it's important that we think about, just because culturally, the people that we you know, engaging with might have different experiences that we may not necessarily completely understand or engage with within our own communities, with our own families. It doesn't necessarily mean that those behaviors or ways of thinking are problematic. Doesn't mean that it's always a safeguarding issue. So be really, really careful about thinking through these things before taking steps that can make people's lives a little bit worse unnecessarily. And that's it for me. Thank you very much. Obviously, if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat, and you know, we can have a wider conversation about this a little bit. later. Now I'm going to hand you over to Sophie, who is going to tell us a little bit more about checking your thinking and anti-racism.
Thank you, Melissa. I'm not going to turn my screen on everybody because I'm worried that it's going to collapse again. Thank you for bearing with me before. So I'm just going to take this last part of the session to follow on from what Melissa and Abid have been talking about, to introduce some work that we've been involved in that was supported, commissioned, by the Welsh Government and developed in partnership, also led by Janine Davis at Listen Up Research, along with members of our advisory group. And these are some anti-racist practice resources, so you can follow the link there and they're available online. The idea of check your thinking is that reflection and discussion and positive challenge can be the starting point for action. So these resources invite you to check your thinking about racism and what it means to be anti-racist, while also provoking you to think about what assumptions you and the colleagues you work with might have about families and children and young people, and about your colleagues too, and to reflect on your practice. So these resources are available online. We encourage you to visit the website and to engage with them on your own and in discussion with your team, but we also have them in hard copy as well. If you'd like any of that, please do contact me. I'm just going to pick up though on two key messages from the cards because it follows on very nicely from what Melissa was talking about. So just to move on to the next slide, and this is about being reflexive and how it can help us in being anti-racist and tackling racism. So as Melissa's already explained, who you are, where you were born, your community, how you grew up, your family, whether you practice a faith or not, what traditions and rituals you engage in, your body and how you are in the world, and your life experiences. These all inform your values and what you think of as common sense and as normal and the way things are or should be. But it's about recognizing that this is just the way things are to you. And generally being reflexive means to reflect on those things and make them explicit to yourself and to begin to become aware of your own values, norms, and what we think and why we think it. And this can help us to consider different ways of doing things and different life experiences and different ways of being normal and doing normal. So as part of your role, but generally as people, it's important to understand the families and the people that you work with. And that means to understand difference and to think about different traditions, cultures, and different norms. So making what is familiar to you strange, so yourself, what's familiar to you, can help you to make what can be seemingly strange familiar. And thinking about this in relation to anti-racist practice can only benefit your work, because if you understand the families that you work with better, you will have a better understanding of the context of any safeguarding issues, and it will also help you to make better judgments. So a key thing can be to think about being curious and being curious in a positive way. So think about the families you're working with now. How much do you understand them? What would it be helpful to know about them? What questions might you want to ask? How might you invite discussion about ideas of safety and about parenting and about play or about celebration? So we've got some questions there at the top, but if you think about the assumptions you might make about what a good childhood looks like, or assumptions about birthdays and celebrations, or assumptions about mess and what a messy house looks like, and assumptions about whether it's safe for children to play outside and be outside until when, and assumptions about key festivals and celebrations in the year. These are all the kinds of questions that you might begin with to begin to start to understand and to be curious about asking questions about understanding the families that you're working with. The second thing I want to pick up on in the next slide is what's the reason that we're here, which is about tackling racism. And a starting point is to acknowledge that, you know, this is a really important point, is that families and individuals you work with will have experienced racism. And this can be because of systems and processes, or it can be as a result of the individual actions of people and people that they've been in contact with. And this is in the background to their experiences and to their experiences of care and their experiences with welfare and support agencies. And this is what Melissa was really getting you to begin thinking about. So making a commitment to being anti-racist means to acknowledge this and to accept this. And it's about making a commitment to be explicit to yourself about your own biases, to understand and to make a commitment to changing these. So being anti-racist is also about action to make sure people are treated fairly. It means speaking up and challenging racism when you see it and hear it. So as Abid was talking about, it can be helpful to think about whether and what concerns or anxieties you have about discussing race and racism. So what stops you from talking about these issues, and what help do you need to feel more confident? What questions might you be too embarrassed to ask or feel worried about asking? Is there any language that you're concerned about and you think, I just don't even know how to raise the question? And we're inviting you to ask any questions in the chat here as well. But it's also really important to think about the impact on families and those that you're working with when you don't speak up and you don't talk about these issues. Think about how they might feel, and always think about how that silence feels and what the impact of that silence might be for your colleagues and for those you're supporting. So we're inviting you to ask any questions that you have now. I think, as Abid was saying, when I kind of dropped out of the session, sometimes our fear of getting things wrong, of saying the wrong thing, our concern that in our ignorance that we might cause harm or offense, it can mean that we don't speak out or speak up or ask questions and take the opportunity to learn. But if you're here, you're already showing that you have a willingness to learn about racism and difference. And we want you to take the opportunity to ask questions and to take advice. And so if that's the purpose of the session, then we know that it's better to ask, and therefore it has to be okay to sometimes get it wrong. And what we ask is that if that's the case, you use that as learning, apologize if necessary, and take it forward. So Melissa was mentioning, we have these two in-person events. So if you go online, if you haven't already, if you look at the cards, and you'll see that there's a whole range of discussion points there and some consideration that we can begin to have in terms of discussion about what it means to be anti-racist, to think about our biases, to think about how we might ask questions, to think about how we might engage with difference and think about difference and think about our own values and norms. And so we have these two events because that's probably a more appropriate place to begin engaging in discussion about these. So please do sign up for those if you're interested. So what I'm going to leave you with in the final question there is that just from this session, is there anything that you can commit to doing as a result of what you've heard in the last hour? And do you have any questions? And is there anything that you would like to learn more about? If you could, we just invite you now just to ask any of those in the chat in the final time that we have.